Yeah, so obviously with the show we try and do a domestic segment and an international segment, and this is the last topic we'll do for the domestic one, but it is an important one. Gough Whitlam, a former Prime Minister of Australia, passed away on Tuesday. He was aged 98. And the main reason I wanted to discuss him was because the story of how he was dismissed back in 1975 should be enough to open people's minds to the idea that just because you're an ally of the US and just because we mostly have white skin here in Australia, it doesn't mean that they're not going to interfere with our politics the way they interfere in so many other countries. And so what I'll do is, we haven't got too much time. I need to move on to the international stuff, but I'll give a quick background on what happened with Gough Whitlam in 1975, and then we'll have a quick chat. But basically, Gough was the Prime Minister from 1972 to 1975. He won the 1972 election and the 1974 double dissolution election against Billy McMahon and Billy Snedden, respectively. And he was dismissed by our Governor-General Sir John Kerr in the 1975 constitutional crisis. Now, for those listeners who aren't aware how the Australian system works, it's based on the Westminster system, so it's not so dissimilar to places like Canada and New Zealand and Britain. The Governor-General is essentially above the politics and very rarely does anything. In fact, the only time that we've had a Prime Minister dismissed was in 1975, and we don't have time to go into the background of the 75 constitutional crisis, except to say that Gough Whitlam thought that he would be okay if he went to the Governor-General and asked for a new election. Instead, the Governor-General, Kerr, gave the Prime Ministership to his opponent, Fraser, and next thing you know, Fraser's the Prime Minister. They call a new election for 1975, and Fraser wins the 75 election, and that's the end of Gough Whitlam's political career. Here's the interesting part. Remember that in 1973, the CIA had overthrown the Chilean leader Salvador Allende and installed Augusto Pinochet. So they were in form when it came to overthrowing countries of the governments they didn't like. In November 1975, just before the 1975 election, Gough Whitlam himself declared that the then Country Party leader, Doug Anthony, had close ties to the CIA. So don't take my word for it that the CIA was involved. Gough himself said back in 1975 that the then Country Party, which is now called, of course, the National Party, leader Doug Anthony had close ties to the CIA. And in 1966, Kerr himself had joined the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was an international anti-communist group. Now, the CIA's own website has said of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and I'll quote, "The Congress for Cultural Freedom is widely considered one of the CIA's more daring and effective Cold War covert operations," end quote. So that's the CIA's own description of this group that 1966 Kerr himself had joined. Now, John Pilger has a terrific article about all of this from earlier this year, and I'll link to it in the info box underneath our video today. But here's a short passage. Quote, "In interviews in the 1980s with the American investigative journalist Joseph Trento, executive officers of the CIA disclosed that the Whitlam problem had been discussed with urgency by the CIA's director, William Colby, and head of MI6, Sir Maurice Oldfield, and that arrangements were made. A deputy director of the CIA told Trento, Kerr did what he was told to do," end quote. Now, if you read that article by John Pilger, you'll see a whole heap more damning evidence that the CIA was involved in that ousting of Gough Whitlam. But the best evidence, and I'll link to that again in the info box, the best evidence comes from a guy called Christopher Boyce. Now, there was a US spy named Christopher Boyce who in the 1970s was convicted and jailed for selling secret information to the Soviets, and he was eventually released 25 years later. So he was jailed for a long time because he had sold some very important secret information. Now, he worked in the CIA Black Vault Communications Relay Room in California, where much of the information came from Pine Gap. Now, Pine Gap, I'm sure many of our listeners are familiar with it, but here's the basics of it. It's a satellite tracking station just outside of Alice Springs in the heart of Australia. And its operations began around 1970 when hundreds of American personnel were stationed there. And it's now home to, depending on who you listen to, up to 1,000 CIA and NSA personnel. Now, in 1982, a 60 Minutes reporter by the name of Ray Martin, who I'm sure many of our older listeners will be more than familiar with, conducted an interview with Boyce from his prison in Kansas. And I'll just read a short passage from that interview. Ray Martin, Only the Russians know exactly what secrets Christopher Boyce gave them, but the CIA calls what he did the most damaging act of espionage in decades. Boyce says that what finally turned him into a spy was America's deception of Australia. Christopher Boyce: my government was deceiving an ally, perhaps had been an ally for 2 world wars, an English-speaking parliamentary democracy. I thought it was indicative of to what my country had sunk to. Ray Martin: Boyce and his espionage accomplice, Andrew Dalton Lee, sold the Russians the codes and other secret details of both the Rhyolite and Argus projects. According to Boyce, that is much more than the Americans' partner, Australia, ever got. Christopher Boyce: when the Rhyolite project was first put in place, the executive agreement meant that all information was to be shared between the American government and the Australian government. And along came Mr. Whitlam. When I went to work for the project, the initial security briefing that I had, I was told that, in fact, we weren't going to live up to that agreement, and that we hadn't been, and that there was information that was being withheld, and also that the Argus project, which was the Advanced Rhyolite project, was to be hidden from the Australians. End quote. Now, the Rhyolite and Argus projects were centered on advanced satellites to monitor the Soviet and Chinese rocket launches. And I'll link to that entire transcript from the 60 Minutes interview in the info box, but I'll just give you a few more quick quotes from Christopher Boyce. Quote: Mr. Whitlam was not a popular figure at all within TRW, to say the least. Mr. Whitlam was, by wanting to know what was going on there at Pine Gap, and by publicising it, was compromising the integrity of the project. Mr. Whitlam's government was a threat. There was a bit of celebration that Mr. Whitlam had been canned. There was references to your Governor-General by the Central Intelligence residents there at TRW in the Rhyolite project. They called Mr. Kerr our man Kerr. Well, my conclusion is that either Central Intelligence directly or through intermediaries would have had to have infiltrated the hierarchy of your trade unions at some level. End quote. That is just a few things that Boyce had to say back in 1982. And again, this is a man who was imprisoned for selling secrets. This isn't some crackpot conspiracy theorist. This isn't someone like me who reads books and studies history and wants to tell you what I think. This is a guy who would know very well. He spent 25 years in the slammer for selling the secrets to the Soviets. And he says, in his own words, Whitlam was taken out by the CIA. He wasn't liked because he investigated things like Pine Gap. And of course, Pine Gap still exists here in Australia. To this day, our parliamentarians are given no access to it. This is all legitimate stuff. And so, with the passing of Gough Whitlam, I thought it was the right time to mention some of these things, because for someone like me, when I first started learning about the constitutional crisis and the CIA ties, that was one of the first things that opened my mind to just the extent, the tentacles of the CIA. And that's why I wanted to discuss that issue with you guys today. Now, Lindsey, you were a young man back during the 75 constitutional crisis. Do you have anything to add to what I've said?
Yes. I haven't got, going demented, I haven't got the names at my fingertips, but there was quite a scandal on about CIA people. And I'll try and do some research during the week. I might be able to update you on that. One of the vivid memories of CIA was George Bush Sr. coming down off a plane, I think it might have been Sydney Airport, and laying down the law to us and what we would do and what we wouldn't do. And I was taken back by this. I thought, man, I mean, I know he's something, but just to treat us with absolute contempt and tell us what and it just became clear to me then, all right, we're a vassal state. That's anyway, that was just one of the memories that I've always carried of that man. Yeah, there was no diplomatic effort at all. He was just laying down the law to us.
This was George H.W. Bush,
yeah.
who before he became president of the United States was the head of the CIA.
Yes.
I mean, this is why I say to people, look, conspiracy theories are interesting and I love them, but you know what? History is even more fascinating because so few people know anything about it. The head of the CIA later became the president of the United States. His son became president of the United States, and it gets better. Guess who's running for the Republican nomination for the 2016 presidential election? Yes. It's his other son.
Yes.
And you want me to believe this is all coincidence? Get out of here.
Yeah.
Now, Ethan, I know that you as well like to study intelligence, especially in this country. Everything that I've just gone through here, this all corroborates with stuff that you know as well, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, it's referred to by many people that study this as the forgotten coup that happened here in Australia. And through this week, there's actually been a couple of good international sites that have done actually articles on this too, in reference to Gough Whitlam dying, saying, "Hey, remember that the CIA had influence through it, and this is the extent of control that's through it." And don't get me wrong, I'm not the biggest fan of Gough Whitlam in the world, but he did do some things that did challenge the system, and one of them was, trying to discover more about Pine Gap, which obviously now today, it's been revealed that we were helping drop drones. We were directing drones from Pine Gap here in Australia that were being dropped in Yemen and Pakistan and Libya. We were directing them here from Pine Gap, and there's obviously a lot more has come out from Pine Gap about the extent of metadata collection and the influence that it's had throughout Australia. But Gough Whitlam was the first Prime Minister to come out and say, "Hey, look, I want to know what's going on there. I want to regain some control of the country that I'm supposedly supposed to be leading." Yeah. And since then, it's come out that the CIA influences completely throughout everything. We've talked about Udof Utkot talking about the journalism industry, about CIA assets in there. Bob Carr was revealed as leaking Labor Party secrets back to the CIA since around the time that Gough Whitlam was dismissed. And I think it's interesting because these people, the majority of the public have no idea about this, and they're not going to be told by the mainstream media because, that's just what happened. And for someone to not question, hey, the Governor General just dismissed a Prime Minister, and all of these quotes have come out and people saying that he was a threat to the establishment by enforcing all of these things, trying to enforce legislation to have a more transparent, open society, a society with universal health care, recognising Indigenous rights. All of these things that he was doing were going against years of tradition. And he was a threat, much like the same mirror image that JFK was when he was trying to come out to say, hey, we oppose secret societies in our country. And by the time I'm out of office, I'll expose this plot. It's just interesting to see that with historical facts that the CIA and secret societies are riddled all throughout our facets of life, and this was one of the primary examples of that, which
just came to the surface.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think it's there. It's like a huge ocean, and every now and again it comes to the surface, and you see one or two instances of how it's affecting us.
Yeah, and with the mainstream media, I mean, one of the things that you have to understand as you do more of your own research is that you understand that the mainstream media doesn't really have to hide things. That 1982 interview was a 60 minutes interview. That was a mainstream interview at the time. Earlier this year, and I'll repeat a quote in a moment, the Australian Roundtable article talking about how Boyce still maintains his view to this day. They can report on these things, but if it's just one report every few years, it's very quickly forgotten by the masses. That's why when they're on a propaganda campaign to take away our civil liberties, and we're going to discuss Canada in the international segment soon, that's why it's constant bombardment, because the average person has an attention span of a goldfish. Yeah. So if the mainstream media does cover this once or twice a decade, who cares? When they want you to know something, that's when they bombard you with it 24/7. And earlier this year, The Australian, which of course is our national broadsheet owned by Uncle Rupert, they did print an article talking about how Boyce still maintains his views because he's out of prison now. He did 25 years, now he's out, and they interviewed him once again. And there's a quote that I want to finish this little topic on, and this is a quote from Boyce from The Australian article. Quote, "To me, that was a coup. You Australians can call it whatever you want." End quote. And hey, like I always say to people, what do I know? What do you know? This guy knows what he's talking about. And if he says that's a coup, the very least that someone ought to do is to look into it for themselves, Lindsey.
Yeah, I agree.
But that's enough from